To wrap up this section, let's do a quick exercise that combines everything we have learned so far. Head over to the final sheet in this file. Now let's assume the company's bonus policy is as follows. For the employees in the sales department, everyone is eligible for bonus, regardless of their tenure or the revenue achievement. For the employees outside of the sales, only those who have spent more than 6 months with the company and also exceeded their revenue target are eligible. To solve this, we'll bring together all the three logical functions. First of all, we will use the AND function to identify the employees who have met both the tenure and the revenue performance criteria. So I'm going to type in and for the first logical test, I'm going to evaluate whether the tenure is greater than 6 months. And for the second logical argument, I'm going to evaluate whether the revenue is greater than the target. Close the bracket, copy, and paste. In the second step, we'll apply the OR function. In the first argument of the OR function, we're going to evaluate whether the employee relates to the sales department or not. And for the second argument, we will check if they have passed the AND test for tenure and performance, which we did in the last step. So I'm just going to give reference to the result of the AND function. Close the bracket. As you can see, the OR function has returned true for all the employees in the sales department. For employees outside of the sales, it has returned true only when both the conditions are met. That is, having more than 6 months of tenure and achieving the revenue target. Finally, we can wrap the result of the OR function inside the if function to clearly determine and identify which employees are eligible for bonus and which are not. So I'm going to write an if statement just before the OR statement. In the logical test of the if statement, we're going to key in the OR function that we had already written. And if the answer of the OR function is true, we want to return back eligible, comma. If the answer is not true, we're going to return not eligible. So in this section, we explored some powerful logical functions and saw how they can be combined to handle real-world business rules. Next, we're going to move on to the lookup functions, which will help us retrieve and connect our data more efficiently. We'll start by understanding what the lookup functions are, where lookup functions are used, and why they matter. Then, we will walk through some simple examples using Vlookup, Xlookup, and Xlookup functions. We'll also cover more advanced cases like how to look up where there are multiple lookup values, and also how to handle errors in an efficient way. So what are lookup functions? At a very basic level, these functions help you find a value from one table, which we call the source table or also the lookup table, and bring that value into another table, which is also called the target table. Let's jump into a few examples to see how it works. Let's first navigate to the basic Vlookup sheet. Here we've got two tables, the lookup table and the target table. The lookup table has two columns, the salesperson name and the respective sales amount. The target table has the same two columns, but here we have names of only 3 salespeople, Jacob, Michael, and Andy. Our objective here is to pick up the relevant values of these employees from the lookup table and bring it into the second column of the target table. We can achieve this result via the Vlookup formula. Let's go ahead and type in the Vlookup function. The Vlookup function has 4 arguments. The first one is the lookup value. This is the value based on which we want the function to perform the lookup. So in this example, I'm going to select cell B4, which contains the name of the salesperson. Second argument is the table array. In our example, this refers to the lookup table. Or in other words, it refers to the table from which we want the function to retrieve the value. So here, I'm going to select the table from where I want the function to retrieve the value, which is the lookup table. The third argument is column index number. Here, we need to input the column number from which we want the function to retrieve the result. I want the function to bring in the sales value. The sales value is in the second column of the table array that we have provided to the function. So I'm going to put in 2. And the last argument, which is optional, is the range lookup or the type of match. This basically means whether we want the formula to find the exact match of the lookup value or we can allow some level of estimation. For now, we want the exact match, so I'm going to select false. Now I'm going to close the bracket and it will retrieve the right value for us. Now I want to drag the formula for rest of the employees, but before that, I'm going to freeze the table array that we have provided to the function. And after that, I can copy and paste the formula to the rest of the cells. Before moving on, I want to highlight a very important watch out. It's a mistake that many people often make, and it's related to the selection of the table array. The table array we provide to the function should not always be the full lookup table like we did in this example. Instead, you have to select the table range very carefully such that the first column of your table array should be the column that contains the lookup value. Let me explain this further with the help of an example. I'm going to remove the formulas that we had put in. And now let's assume our lookup table had 3 columns. The first column was salesperson code. Now let's apply the formula again. I'm going to select the lookup value. And for table array, I'm going to again select the entire lookup table. And you'll see that the formula will not work. This is because the Vlookup function tries to find the lookup value in the first column of the table array provided. In the first column of this table array, there is a salesperson code and not the salesperson name, so the formula throws out an error. If we correct it, that is, I'll select the same 2 arrays that we selected before, and I'm going to give the column number 2, it will give us the right results. Next, we are going to look into the Hlookup function. Let's navigate to the Hlookup sheet. Hlookup basically is the mirror image of the Vlookup function. So if you have a clear understanding of Vlookup, Hlookup should be a walk in the park. In simple terms, Hlookup is used when your lookup table is arranged in a horizontal format. Like you can see in this example, we have the same exact data as we had on the previous page. It's just transposed and arranged in a horizontal manner. So if we want to retrieve a value from this lookup table, we can use the Hlookup function. So let's put in the Hlookup. The syntax of the Hlookup function is also very similar to the Vlookup. First, we have got the lookup value, for which I'm going to provide the salesperson name. Next, we have the table array, for which I will select the horizontal table from which I want the function to retrieve the value. Next, we have the row index number, and this is one of those aspects which is different in Hlookup function versus the Vlookup. In Vlookup, we had the column index number in the third argument. Here we have the row number. So in this case, the resultant value, that is the sales amount, is in the second row of the table array. So I'm going to put in 2. And I want the formula to retrieve an exact match of the lookup value. So I'm going to put in false. And there we go. Again, I can freeze the ranges by pressing the F4 key on my keyboard and drag the formula down. Next, we're going to look into the Xlookup function. Xlookup does the same job as Vlookup or Hlookup, but it's incredibly simple and flexible. Let's navigate to the Xlookup sheet. Here we have the same dataset as our first exercise on Vlookup. Let's try to solve it using the Xlookup function. So let's type in Xlookup. Xlookup function has a total of 6 arguments, but only 3 of them are mandatory. That is lookup value, lookup array, and resultant array. For lookup value, we will again provide the salesperson name. For lookup array, we will give reference to the column that contains the lookup values. So in this case, it will be the first column. And for the return array, we will give reference of the column that contains the resultant values, or the values we want the formula to bring in for us. And in this case, it's the sales amount column. Let's close the formula, and there we go. One important watch out here is that the size of the lookup array and the return array should be exactly the same. Otherwise, the formula can throw an error. For example, here, I'm going to change the size of the lookup array. I'll make it smaller, hit enter, and you can see it's giving an error. So let's do a quick comparison of the Xlookup function with the traditional lookup formulas. First of all, as we saw, Xlookup has a much simpler syntax than the traditional lookup functions. Secondly, Xlookup can retrieve values from both the direction. The traditional lookup functions are restricted and can only look up value from one direction. Let's learn it via an example. I'm going to copy and paste the same exact data down. And this time around, I have flipped the lookup table such that the first column is the sales amount and the second column has the salesperson name. Now, if I want to retrieve the sales amount from this table, I cannot do it using the Vlookup function. Let's try it out. So I'm going to put in the lookup value, select the table, and it doesn't work. This is because the Vlookup function picks up the resultant value only if the resultant value is on the right-hand side of the lookup value column. In this case, the sales amount, which is the resultant value, is on the left-hand side of the lookup column, so the Vlookup will not work here. However, Xlookup can do the job for us. I'm going to use Xlookup again, put in the lookup value, select the lookup array, which in this case is the second column. I know the headings are flipped around, so don't worry about that. And then the return array will be the sales amount. There we go. Coming back to our comparison, a third advantage of Xlookup is that it has inbuilt error handling function. Whereas for traditional lookup formula, we have to do some workaround to handle the errors. We'll look into it in more detail towards the end of this video. Now the question is, if Xlookup has so many benefits, why do we really need to learn about Vlookup or Hlookup? Well, the answer is that if you're building a new Excel sheet or a model from scratch, you can always use the Xlookup function. It's far easier and flexible. However, it's important to have some awareness of Vlookup function or the legacy formulas. Let's say if you come across an old Excel file which was built 8 to 9 years back, chances are high that it will still have the Vlookup formulas. Therefore, it's always good to have the understanding of the legacy functions, but if you're building something new, feel free to use Xlookup always.